What's the scariest true story you have ever heard or are able to tell? Story 1. I met a guy who had been traveling around Australia with a couple of friends. Hitchhiking, as many of us had done. One of his friends told him they were near his distant uncle's house, whom he'd never met before. He got a phone number from a family member, and, as they had hoped, the uncle offered them a place to stay. He picked them up in town and drove them out to his rural property, far out in the bush. They said he seemed like a pretty normal guy, friendly and cheerful. When it was time to set up a place to sleep, the uncle took them to a closet that was completely full of sleeping bags and bedrolls. They didn't think much of it at the time, and all grabbed a kit and set up on the living room floor. They stayed a couple of days and nothing seemed out of the ordinary, and afterward, the uncle drove them to the bus station and they continued on their way. About a year later, that man was arrested and charged with several serious crimes. He turned out to be the individual who had been picking up young backpackers and harming them. The guy who told me this story was absolutely convinced he had slept in the sleeping bag of one of the victims. Story 2. There's a strange story that has stuck with me. A man went missing in 2004. He had left home without shoes or a jacket in October, and just before he disappeared, he had called some friends and asked if they wanted to go to the sauna with him. Something quite normal for a Friday night in Finland. His girlfriend came home from work to find an empty house, the lights on, and the front door open. The case went cold, and he was not found. 4 years later, children were playing in the woods near his home and noticed what they thought was a scarecrow high up in a spruce tree. They told their parents, who came to investigate, and immediately called the authorities. It wasn't a scarecrow. It was the body of the man who had gone missing 4 years earlier. He was tied to the tree, and the body had apparently been there the entire time. It was officially ruled as a suicide. However, according to some users on Finnish discussion forums, the rope wasn't tied around his neck as one would expect in such cases. He was reportedly sitting on a branch facing the trunk, and his body had been tied at 3 or 4 points to the tree. That setup doesn't quite match a typical case of self-harm. The man had a history of drug use and had served time in prison for drug-related offenses. Some speculate his sudden disappearance and the unusual circumstances surrounding his death may have been linked to debts. One theory is that someone forced him to climb the tree and left him there. Another detail, local newspapers did not report exactly where or how he was found, just that children had made the discovery and no foul play was suspected. Story 3. In my city, there's a theme park called Dream World. One of the rides was called Thunder River Rapids. It was a flume-style attraction with round gondolas designed to simulate a storm. A few years ago, at the end of the ride, the gondolas were being transferred from the water back onto the conveyor belt for the next group of riders when one of them flipped over. Tragically, the passengers were caught in the machinery below and lost their lives. The only survivor was a young girl who had been quickly lifted and moved aside by her uncle. In a split-second decision, he seemed to understand what would have happened to her. He didn't survive. Investigations revealed that severe negligence contributed to the incident. Reports stated that there were about 7 seconds available to press the emergency stop. One operator claimed they pressed it, but it didn't activate immediately. The ride had experienced technical issues multiple times that day. Yet it continued to operate. The case remains under review. I watched an interview with the grandmother who was on vacation with the family. She lost nearly all her loved ones that day, except for her granddaughter. It was one of the most emotionally devastating interviews I've ever seen. Story 4. In my town in Massachusetts, it's generally not common for children to ride their bikes home from school alone. In 1978, a young girl named Mary Lou Arruda was taken while riding her bike. The person responsible drove past her own home while she was in the back of the vehicle. Unable to call for help, she was later discovered in a nearby state forest. Authorities had a suspect, but due to procedural errors in the investigation, at one point even involving a psychic, the initial conviction was overturned. The case deeply affected the entire community. Even years later, until the individual passed away in 2016, everyone who lived through that time could recall the incident in vivid detail, who was involved, where it happened, and every related fact. Some of the officers from that time, now elderly, still remember everything from the model of the car to the specifics of the investigation. Because of that event, my family never let me walk home from school alone, even though our house was only 5 minutes away. To this day, my relatives are still strict about never allowing kids to ride bikes by themselves. Story 5. In the 1960s, a man who owned a plastic decorations company in New York City had a secret relationship with one of his employees, believed to be from El Salvador. When she became pregnant, something tragic happened. The man took her life and tried to hide what he had done by placing her in a 55-gallon drum, partially filled with a dyeing agent from his warehouse. He added pellets for weight, intending to dispose of it in a lake. However, the drum was too heavy to move, so he left it in the crawl space beneath his family's home. Over the decades, multiple families lived in that house. None of them moved the drum because of its weight. Finally, one family decided to get rid of it. When they opened it, they found a purse inside. Authorities were called, and it was discovered that the barrel contained the remains of a pregnant woman and documents that helped identify her. This discovery occurred in the late 1990s. The woman's mother, who was in her 90s by then, had reportedly experienced recurring dreams over the years, visions of her daughter trapped inside a barrel. When law enforcement went to arrest the former business owner, now in his 70s, he had already taken his own life shortly after learning they were at his door. It was clear he knew why they had come. Story 6. I was at a bonfire where people were sharing ghost stories, and a friend told us this story about his aunt in Mexico. When she was a little girl, around 6 or 7, I think, she lived on a ranch near some mountains. One day she was out playing and went missing. Many people from the area came to help search for her and called out her name, but she didn't respond. I think he said about a week passed, and the family had started to lose hope. Then suddenly she walked out of the trees, dirty and with her mouth sewn shut. The family rushed her to the hospital immediately. The story the little girl told was that she had been wandering through the woods when some beings she called duende approached her and asked if she wanted to play. So she went with them deeper into the forest. When she began to feel hungry, they told her she had to stay, so she did. Eventually, as it got darker, she made her way back home. She thought she had only been gone for a couple of hours, not an entire week. Apparently, she was never quite the same afterward and grew up to be a very quiet, withdrawn woman. He said she still had scars on her face from that time. While many people around the fire were talking about how these beings are believed to be real, especially by those who visit family in Mexico, what made this story so unsettling was the possibility that this young girl may have been taken from the family ranch and held somewhere in the woods. Whatever she went through was so distressing that she may have created the story to cope with it. And whoever held her might have silenced her in a cruel way, assuming she wouldn't survive or return home. Story 7. I was hitchhiking through South Australia. Heading west, I was about 14, and I got picked up by a car full of guys in their 20s driving an old HQ. They were clearly under the influence. At one point, one of them told me they were going to a party and asked if I wanted to come. I was on a sort of walkabout journey to find myself and have new experiences, so I agreed. But then the driver got really upset. He shouted, "No, absolutely not. Not again." Then he slammed on the brakes in the middle of nowhere and told me to get out. I was confused, and the other guys in the car started protesting, but the driver looked me straight in the eyes and repeated, "Get out now." He seemed completely serious, so I did. The others were yelling, but I found myself standing on the side of the road, hundreds of kilometers from anything. Looking back, I'm not sure what they had planned, but I'm fairly confident it wouldn't have ended well for me. Still, I got lucky. Story 8. I grew up in the suburb where the Green River cases took place. Gary Ridgway was arrested in 2001, which was right around the time I was finishing middle school and about to start high school. Everyone in town seemed to have a small story about him, whether it was someone claiming he lived nearby, seeing him around, or saying something like, "My uncle's coworker used to know him." Later in high school, I became best friends with someone whose mom had worked at the Kenworth factory where Gary worked. She said they used to joke that he might be the person behind the cases because he would always call in sick the day after one occurred. Even more unsettling, a few weeks after each reported incident, jewelry would randomly appear in the women's restroom. Just left on the sink, people would turn it into the lost and found, and when it went unclaimed, they would sometimes keep it. It turned out, according to investigators, that he may have done this to watch women around the factory wear those items. Taken from the individuals he targeted, she told me she had kept one piece of jewelry that she later had to turn in as evidence. Story 9. At a Christmas party, my former boss casually shared a story that left everyone in silence. Back in the 1980s, he built a house in the countryside of Victoria. During construction, he would regularly visit the site in the mornings to see the progress and chat with the workers. One morning, he arrived to find the crew already pouring the concrete foundation for the garage. He thought it was unusual because they had started work very early. A worker came rushing over, explaining that they had other jobs later that day and were trying to finish up quickly. They also told him that his presence wasn't needed, so he left for work. After the garage was completed, he began to notice a strange layer of brown dust seeping through the concrete floor. He would sweep it away, but it kept coming back, until one day it just stopped. About a year later, he learned that one of the builders was being investigated in connection to a missing person case involving a well-known woman who had appeared on a TV game show. He told us he never went to the police because he didn't want his house to be torn apart in a search. He has since sold the property. The story cast a shadow over the party. While he tried to make light of it afterward, everyone else was clearly disturbed. I've tried looking up information about the missing woman but haven't found anything. I still wonder if it's even possible for anything to seep through dried concrete, but the idea alone really stuck with me. Story 10. One story that used to frighten me as a child was one my mother told about her own difficult upbringing in the 1960s. Her mother had a dark side and was deeply involved in strange rituals. One time she dressed entirely in black and gathered neighborhood children to chant with her around a small black box. After the ritual, she threw the box into a lake. My mother never found out what the purpose of that event was, but just thinking about it still gives her chills. Her mother didn't like children and once tied her own son, who had special needs, to a tree as punishment and left him there for hours. There was also another story I heard from my dad's friend, a doctor who was always serious and never talked much. One day, though, he shared something that had happened to him while he was in medical school. He heard noises in his apartment one night and, feeling uneasy, picked up a knife and went to check the living room. He didn't see anything, so he went back to his bedroom, only to find that one side of his twin-bed spring mattress had somehow folded completely in half and was standing upright on the bed frame. He ran out of the apartment immediately. When he returned later, everything was back to normal. He said he never had another experience like that again, but it was the one thing in his life that he couldn't explain. Story 11. This happened in my late teens. I was with a group of friends, and we decided to go camping. We always picked the same spot simply because it was remote and located by the river that flows out of the lake. There's only one road in and one road out. It's isolated with no cell service, and on either side of the road are steep drop-offs. It's so steep and rocky that it's hard to imagine anyone hiking up either side. There's a spot perfect for fishing under a little bridge along this road. We set up camp, and as it began to get dark, we decided to do some catfishing and gathered our gear. All four of us headed back up to the bridge. When we got to the point where the bridge was in view, one friend nudged me and nodded toward it. There was a dark figure pacing back and forth along the bridge. It looked human, but it was unusually tall and thin, almost distorted, like if someone had stretched a person vertically. It was nearly completely dark, but the figure stood out clearly against the moonlight. That image is burned into my memory. We quickly turned back and headed toward our campsite, thinking we could at least find safety in our vehicle. As we got about halfway back, we saw a huge fire in the middle of the road. It took up most of the narrow dirt path. One of my friends managed to find a small but rough path around it. Fortunately, we didn't have a lot of camping supplies, so we threw them in the truck, loaded up, and drove back, hoping to use the water from our ice chest and gallon jugs to put the fire out. But when we got to the spot where the fire had been, it was gone. All that remained was a blackened area on the road. We haven't gone back since. I don't know what that was about. I assume someone was playing a prank on us, but I still can't explain how they did everything. It still scares me to this day. Story 12. This goes back a couple of years. It was the summer of my sophomore year in high school, and I was working at a local pizza place. I got off early one day, called my buddy, and we made plans to go over to our other friend's farm after he got off work. We got there early, let ourselves into the pasture, and spent some time shooting arrows until we got bored. Then we decided to walk down the road until we reached the private property sign, where the road turned to gravel. We kept going about a quarter mile and saw fresh tire tracks leading into some dense bushes. We followed the tracks and found a cream-colored 1990s Toyota 4Runner hidden deep in the brush. I approached from the right, and my friend came from the left. As I got closer, I noticed what looked like someone had wiped something off the passenger side of the windshield. The vehicle was parked inside the brush, with the back seats down and a sheet draped over a figure. We looked at each other and ran back to the farm, unsure of what to do. We debated calling the police, but were nervous about being on private property. We waited until our friend got back to his farm and brought him up there to see it for himself. After a second visit, all three of us agreed the car shouldn't be there, and something wasn't right. As it was getting dark, we went to his neighbor, a retired Air Force pilot, and told him what we saw. He grabbed his flashlight, his truck with floodlights, and instructed us to show him the spot. We drove past the private property sign and parked in a way that let us see the hidden car clearly. We all got out, and he turned on the floodlights. Right as the lights lit up the area, two men ran out from behind the car, jumped in, started the engine, and sped off, skidding past us as we jumped out of the way. We managed to get the license plate and contacted the police. It turned out the vehicle was registered to a missing person who still hadn't been found. Years later, someone pointed out the most unsettling part of the story, something I hadn't considered as a kid. Those two men had probably been watching us the entire time and could have approached us at any moment. Story 13. I just remembered this story from a former roommate. It happened after he moved into a shared living situation with an older gentleman, probably in his 60s, who mostly kept to himself. My roommate traveled a lot for work and also had a girlfriend who lived overseas, so he was often in and out of the house for several days at a time. He barely saw the homeowner and got used to that routine. One time after returning from a 2-week trip, he came home and didn't see any sign of his older roommate. He didn't think much of it. He was exhausted and spent most of the weekend sleeping. A few more days went by, and still no sign of him. The house started to develop a strange smell and an eerie atmosphere overall. By now, you can probably guess where this is going. After a few more days, the homeowner was found in his locked bedroom. He had sadly passed away in his sleep from a heart condition during the time my friend had been away. The discovery itself was distressing. Since the man had no close family, my roommate was forced to move out. The whole experience deeply unsettled him, and he went through a rough period afterward, staying on friends' couches for a while, before eventually moving in with his girlfriend overseas. Story 14. Not extremely scary, but definitely unsettling when it happened to us. I used to live in San Antonio, and around Halloween, we wanted to get into the spooky spirit. We decided to check out some allegedly haunted asylums and the burned-down house of the horse lady. The haunted asylum wasn't very impressive, so we got GPS coordinates for the horse lady's house, parked as close as we could, and started walking. It was deep in the woods, about a 30-minute walk. There were 6 of us, but one guy and one girl stayed back for obvious reasons, so the remaining 4 of us continued onward. It was pitch black, and only 2 of us had phones, each with about 20% battery left. Mine had the flashlight and GPS on, and the other guy kept his phone on standby just in case. We walked and walked, and my phone eventually died, but we were only 5 minutes from the destination marker. My friend turned on his flashlight, and we spotted what might have been the remains of the burned house. Though we weren't sure, we heard a strange moaning noise but figured it was probably an animal. Then, the girl with us screamed. A large spider had dropped down in front of us. It was about the size of my thumb. Pretty big, but nothing too wild. Still, the girl started crying, and we decided to head back. It was late, and the place was a letdown. Since we walked in a straight line, we figured turning around and retracing our steps would be easy enough. We turned around and the guy shone his light ahead. I kid you not. There were suddenly hundreds of spiders and massive webs around us, as if they had appeared during the 2 minutes we stood there. There was no way we had walked 30 minutes without touching even one web. The girl was panicking as we carefully tried to navigate through the webs, doing our best to avoid contact. It ended up taking us over an hour to get back, constantly stopping in clearings to check each other for spiders. None of us could explain what happened, but it definitely freaked us out. Story 15. When my mom was visibly pregnant with my sister, back in the 1990s, she went out with some friends. At the end of the night, they hailed a taxi. My mom got in first, and before her friend could get in, the driver sped off. We lived near a lot of farmland, and he drove her to a remote road on the outskirts of town. He pulled over and climbed into the back seat. My mom, terrified of what might happen to her and her unborn baby, decided to stay calm, at least for the moment. While he was distracted, she managed to get the door open, pushed herself out of the car, and took off running. Fortunately, she saw a farmhouse nearby with lights on and ran toward it, screaming for help. The driver must have decided it wasn't worth chasing her and got back in his car and drove away. When she told me this story, I imagined how terrifying that must have been. It wasn't just her safety at risk. It was her baby's too, even though nothing physically happened. The emotional and psychological impact was enormous. What's even more heartbreaking is that my mom is a survivor of past trauma and had already been through multiple painful experiences. I can't imagine being in her shoes, facing something so terrifying all over again. She reported it to the police, but they said there wasn't enough evidence to move forward, even though other women came forward later. However, my grandmother decided to take matters into her own hands. She reportedly had a group of local guys damage the man's taxis, he had several, and even left butcher scraps on them as a message. He didn't report it to the police. Story 16. This might get lost, but here it goes. A few years ago, my mother-in-law was hospitalized. She had to undergo surgery to remove a dangerous birthmark from her back. The night after the operation, she was completely out from the anesthesia and pain medication, completely unaware of what went on in the shared ward that night. One of the other patients was an elderly woman who had accidentally spilled boiling water on her hand and required a skin graft. The surgery went well, but anesthesia can be especially rough on the brain in older patients. When she regained consciousness, she apparently became very confused. She removed all her clothes and attempted to jump out the window. Thankfully, the other patients noticed and called the nurse, who stopped her in time and sedated her. Everything seemed fine until later that evening. When most people were asleep, the elderly woman got up again, found a small eating utensil from her tray, and walked over to the bed of a 13-year-old girl in the room. She began shouting something about punishing her granddaughter and tried to harm her. Thankfully, the young girl was awake enough to scream, which brought the nurses rushing in. The elderly woman was immediately moved to another room and afterward required constant supervision due to what doctors believed to be permanent cognitive damage caused by the anesthesia. When my wife's mother woke up the next day, she noticed the woman was gone and asked about it. The nurses explained what had happened and confirmed the patient would no longer be left alone. What really unsettled me was realizing that if the confused woman had wandered to my mother-in-law's bed instead, she wouldn't have been able to defend herself at all. Story 17. This was told to my cousin by her grandmother. Apparently, everyone in the family knows the story, but they didn't tell me because I'm younger. Her daughter suddenly stopped eating one day, and absolutely nothing worked. They made her favorite foods, but she would barely nibble and then walk away. Everyone assumed it was just a phase and tried to wait it out. Eventually, they became worried and took her to several doctors, but no one could figure out what was wrong. They said she was just acting out. One day, a friend of the family visited and noticed the girl's condition. After hearing about her behavior, she suggested they take the girl to a wise man in the area. The family agreed, thinking they had nothing to lose. The man observed the girl quietly. Then he crushed up some leaves and gave them to her to eat. After a little while, she threw up. He sifted through what she had expelled and pulled out a lump, a hard blob of butter. He explained that this was the cause of her illness, that he had sensed some sort of negative energy inside her, and this was how he removed it. He said someone had performed some sort of harmful act on the butter and given it to her. The grandmother recalled a neighbor feeding the girl something with great affection at the time, which they had dismissed as a kind gesture. As strange as it sounds, everyone in my family witnessed this and remembered how the girl returned to normal afterward. Today, she has 2 daughters and a granddaughter and is doing completely fine. Story 18. When I was 13, my dad and stepmom bought a house about 25 minutes outside of town. A lot of strange things happened there, but the most unsettling was during our first summer in the house. My cousin had come to stay for a couple of weeks. The street used to be called Mount Zion, and about a 35-minute walk down a winding road surrounded by trees, there's a small cemetery with the same name. I was always into edgy things at that age, and my cousin and I were big fans of prank shows, so we had a tendency to be immature. One day we decided to walk down to the cemetery. We wandered around, joking about some of the names on the headstones, kicking lightly at the stones, though we didn't damage anything, and generally being disrespectful of the space. Some of the headstones were so old, the inscriptions had completely faded. They just looked like worn white rocks. The next day, we overheard my parents having a hushed conversation in the kitchen. They stopped talking when they noticed us, and when I asked what it was about, my stepmom brushed it off and said it was an adult matter. I was a nosy teen and hated being left out, so I kept asking. Later that night, after a few drinks by the fire and my dad had gone to bed, my stepmom finally told us what happened. She said that my dad had woken up around 3 or 4 a.m., completely unable to move. He saw what appeared to be a room full of people standing around the bed, silently staring down at him. He tried to call out to her but was frozen. He closed his eyes, hoping it was a dream, but when he opened them again, they were still there. Eventually, closing his eyes worked, and when he opened them again, the room was empty. He woke my stepmom and told her everything. This really shook me and my cousin. The house was already strange, and while we'd all had little experiences before, nothing that couldn't be explained. But my dad, someone who never believed in anything paranormal, was truly disturbed. They later looked into it and found that it could have been sleep paralysis, so they dismissed it. But a few days later, it happened again. Same time, same presence, same inability to move. After hearing that, I half-jokingly suggested that maybe we needed to apologize for what we did at the cemetery. Maybe the figures were angry at my dad for not controlling his kids. So my cousin and I went back down, apologized aloud, feeling pretty silly, but hoping it would help. Whether coincidence or not, my dad never had another episode like that. He'd never experienced anything like it before either. Even now, almost 15 years later, weird things still happen in that house, and every visitor has noticed something. My dad, once a complete skeptic, now just says, "It's a weird house." Story 19. I actually have one of these stories, and it still gives me chills. When I was a baby, my dad played on a local softball team. It was a casual social team. Lots of families involved, and after games, they'd go out for pizza and beers. My parents were good friends with 2 of the other couples on the team, and each of them had young kids too. One evening, those 2 couples decided to leave their kids at one of their homes, hiring a babysitter to watch all of them. They invited my parents over after the game to have a few drinks, but I was being fussy that night, and my mom decided to skip the invite and just head home with me. Normally, they would have gone. As it turns out, that decision may have saved our lives. When the other parents returned to the house, they walked in on a home invasion. 2 men had broken in, tied up the babysitter, her boyfriend, and all the kids, and waited for the parents to return. Once they did, the intruders held them hostage and forced the fathers to drive to banks and a grocery store, where one of them was a manager, to withdraw money and access a safe. After the men returned with the parents, they ended the situation in the worst possible way, taking the lives of everyone in the house. Both families, the babysitter, and her boyfriend. The 2 men were eventually caught. My dad attended the trial and told me it was the first time in his life he had ever seriously considered supporting the death penalty. I still get goosebumps thinking how close we were to being part of that tragedy. This all happened in Southern California, around 1980 or 1981. I've never tried to look up the case, but the memory still lingers. Story 20. Ozone Club fire in the Philippines. High school and college graduates were partying at this club. The maximum capacity for the venue was about 35 people, but there were over 100 people inside. Not including the staff, there was no proper fire exit, and many people said that the door could only be opened by pushing from the outside or pulling from the inside. When panic broke out, people began pushing, and no one could get the door open. Some stories also claim that security tried to block the door, thinking there was a fight happening inside. Another story that sticks in my mind is about the passenger ship Princess of the Stars. I think it was around the holiday season, possibly Christmas, and many people were trying to get home. The ship reportedly allowed overloading, with around 100 more passengers than it should have had. Survivors said it was extremely packed. Some passengers slept outside the sleeping area, even on walkways or on the small emergency boats, dinghies. People said the ship was swaying left and right due to the imbalance. At some point during the night, the ship collided with an oil carrier. The oil spilled and ignited, setting the sea surface ablaze. Many people lost their lives on board, and many who jumped into the water didn't survive due to the fire. Some say the tragedy could have been avoided, but the ship's crew were reportedly celebrating with drinks on the top deck. Additionally, it was claimed the oil carrier's captain was not licensed. In the investigation, the oil company took most of the blame, while the passenger ship company changed its name afterward. Out of everyone on board, only about 7 people survived. That company still exists today. This happened around 7 or 8 years ago. Story 21. I grew up in a town that was also home to a survivor of the U.S. Indianapolis. He was a friend of the family and active in my mother's church. He had worked in the ship's galley when it was torpedoed in the summer of 1945. He said he was in the galley at midnight, preparing breakfast when the attack occurred. So he jumped out through a porthole. He was generous enough to meet with me several times in high school to share his experiences, help with an interview I needed for a school paper, and offer advice as I considered joining the military. After the ship sank, he spent 5 days floating in the South Pacific, waiting to be rescued. He was fortunate to hold on to the side of a life raft near a rescue net, but he still witnessed many of his shipmates suffer due to exposure, dehydration, and sea predators. Nearly 2,000 men were aboard the ship. Over 1,000 initially survived the sinking, but only 317 were rescued from the water. When I graduated high school, he gave me a signed copy of Doug Stanton's book, In Harm's Way. He told me again about the nightmares that stayed with him. He has since passed away, and I truly hope he's found peace. Story 22. I stumbled into a mass shooting in downtown Seattle a couple of years ago. I can't remember the exact date, but it was around November 2016. If I'm not mistaken, I was working for a construction company at the time and had just gotten off work in Belltown, right in the heart of the city. It was around 6:30 p.m., and I was walking to my bus stop on 3rd Avenue, like most busy city areas. It was loud. Cars, people, usual downtown noise. I was on 4th Avenue about a block away from my bus stop when I heard a sound that didn't fully register at first. I had my headphones in, listening to music. It sounded like someone hammering nails, but it echoed oddly through the streets. Then I heard a woman scream, one of the most terrified screams I've ever heard. I looked up from my phone just as someone ran into me, sprinting past with a look of pure panic. About 15 more people followed, all running in the same direction. I didn't know what was going on, but instinct told me to run too. So I started running through downtown, with no idea why. When I finally stopped, caught my breath, and lit a cigarette, I asked someone nearby what was happening. He said, "Somebody just started shooting people by the 7-Eleven. I thought he was joking at first, but then I saw police swarm the area, sirens blaring, officers directing crowds, ambulances headed toward the 7-Eleven on 3rd and Pike. I had been 1 block away on 4th and Pike. Later that night, the news reported it was related to tension between protest groups following the recent election. Apparently, an argument escalated, and someone in the crowd began shooting at random. If it had happened 5 minutes later, I would have been walking through that exact spot. 2 years later, I still don't know how to process it. Ever since, hearing about similar tragedies gives me intense anxiety. Story 23. My dad has been telling this story for as long as I can remember. He's not the type to exaggerate. And my aunt and uncles who were there also say it really happened. When my dad was younger, he and his siblings were traveling through northern Mexico. They passed through the mountains in the state of Chihuahua and stopped at a bed and breakfast for the night. It gets very cold in that region, so the beds had thick Mexican striped blankets. The room had a strange setup, with some beds pushed together side by side. That night, my dad woke up feeling an incredibly cold sensation running down his back. At the same moment, My aunt sat up screaming and crying. When they turned on the lights, they saw that a section of her hair was missing. She took a while to calm down and then explained that she had been woken by what she described as a cold hand with long fingernails tugging on her hair. They checked under her bed and found strands of her hair scattered on the floor. Nobody slept much after that. The next morning, the owner of the inn casually asked if they had visited them during the night. That was enough for everyone. They quickly packed up and left. To this day, my dad swears it's one of the strangest things that ever happened to him. Story 24. Back in the late 1980s, there was a well-known murder case involving a man and a woman who took the lives of two teenagers. The woman was married to someone else, but had been secretly seeing her boyfriend. The teens, who were apparently neighbors of the man, had sneaked into the house and accidentally discovered the couple together. Instead of running away, they stayed and watched until the couple spotted them. A confrontation followed, and in the heat of the moment, the man accidentally harmed one of the teens fatally. In a state of panic, he harmed the other as well, fearing the truth would come out. The couple then attempted to stage the scene to look like a double suicide by placing the bodies in the bathroom, but they were soon caught by authorities. Both the man and the woman were convicted. It's unclear what happened to the man, but the woman served 20 years in prison. Here's where things get eerie. The woman has since been released, and I've met her, several times actually. She's a bit awkward and seems mentally unwell to me. She often talks to herself and appears to hold grudges. Sometimes I've noticed her staring at people with a strange intensity. However, she is also polite, respectful, and always seems eager to learn or improve herself. I truly hope she continues to get the help she needs. Story 25. Probably the most famous driving at night ghost story is that of Resurrection Mary. The first reported sighting was in the 1930s along Archer Avenue in Chicago, Illinois, where a driver claimed to have seen a young woman dressed in white. Later, similar sightings occurred at the gates of Resurrection Cemetery. Witnesses said she tried to hitch a ride by stepping in front of cars or jumping onto their running boards. Over time, reports expanded to sightings further from the cemetery. Several men claimed to have seen her walking near the O. Henry Ballroom. A few swore they even danced with her at the ballroom before offering to drive her home, only for her to vanish once they approached the cemetery gates. The most common account is of drivers picking her up and seeing her disappear from the passenger seat just as they passed Resurrection Cemetery. All descriptions of her appearance and clothing match. Other stories claim she runs out in front of cars before vanishing. It's widely believed that Resurrection Mary is the spirit of a young woman who left the O. Henry Ballroom after an argument in the 1930s and was tragically struck by a vehicle. Another version says she was walking home from a funeral when the accident occurred. Story 26. This might get lost in the feed, but here it is. A woman in my city recently went on a Tinder date. Everything seemed normal, and the man appeared kind and respectful. But as the night went on, she began feeling unusually drowsy. After stepping into the restroom, she realized she might have been drugged. She told him she wanted to go home, but he insisted on walking her to her door. By that point, she wasn't in a condition to argue. He helped her up to her apartment, saying he just wanted to make sure she got to bed safely. As she was about to pass out, she managed to make a quick call to a family member, possibly her sister, to let them know something was wrong and that she believed she had been drugged. The next thing she remembers is waking up to police officers beside her bed, asking if she was okay. She was confused, but they assured her she hadn't been physically harmed and that she was lucky to have made that call. They gently told her to prepare herself for what they had found downstairs. When she asked to see it, they agreed. Her entire apartment had been covered in plastic sheets, and multiple knives of varying sizes were laid out on the kitchen counter. Story 27. I was working at an internal medicine clinic, answering phones for the doctors, taking messages and passing them along so they could return patient calls. One day I got a call from an older woman, maybe in her late 50s or early 60s. She sounded distressed. She explained that her son had recently moved into his first apartment and that strange things had been happening ever since. She told me his name and that he was a patient of one of our doctors. She said he was 21 years old. When I asked what kind of things were happening, she said doors were being knocked on with no one there. And most disturbingly, His landline phone was ringing constantly, but when he answered, no one was on the other end. This was in the 1990s before cell phones were common. I politely told her that it didn't seem like a medical issue and asked if she had spoken to the phone company or the landlord. That's when she said, "It's not that kind of issue." I asked what she meant, and she explained that the phone wasn't even plugged into the wall and he hadn't activated service yet, but it was ringing off the hook. That's when it clicked. It turned out her son had schizophrenia and had missed several days of medication, even though the situation had a medical explanation. The moment she said the phone wasn't even plugged in sent chills down my spine. Story 28. Many years ago, when I was younger and a bit more reckless, a friend and I heard about a large piece of land that had flooded so many times that the government purchased it under eminent domain and let it return to a wild state. It was said to be home to many feral cattle, and since they had been wild for several generations, they were considered unclaimed under certain local laws. The catch was that the land wasn't exactly legal to be exploring. After a few months of planning, we found an elderly woman who agreed to let us access the property through her back pasture. We set up panels and rerouted part of a fence to build a trap for the cattle. On the morning of the hunt, we backed a stock trailer into place and set off to round up as many animals as we could. We mounted up, went through a gap we had made in the fence, and sent the dogs ahead to track down the cattle. We underestimated how difficult these wild cattle would be to handle, but after a full day's work, we managed to get 17 of them into the trap. It was getting dark, and we still had a couple of dogs missing. Knowing we had already pushed our luck, we decided to gather what dogs we had and head back, but 2 were still gone. We followed the signals from their radio collars for about 2 miles and finally heard them barking in the distance. We found them cornering a young, stocky boar in a thicket of greenbrier. We tied up our horses and crawled in, encouraged the dogs to hold, and my friend restrained the boar while I tied the dogs' collars together so they wouldn't run off again. By then, daylight was gone. We were crawling on our hands and knees trying to find our way out of the thicket and back to the horses. My friend was the first to find the clearing. We were just starting to feel relieved when we suddenly heard a man's voice say, "Are y'all gonna eat that?" Standing right in front of us, holding our horse's reins in one hand and resting his other hand on a hunting knife at his belt, was one of the strangest looking men I've ever seen. He was extremely thin, smelled strongly of vinegar and ammonia, and had sunken features where his teeth should have been. We were both speechless. He asked again, "Are y'all gonna eat that?" We handed over the boar and tried to make casual conversation, but he said nothing more. He simply dropped the reins, took the boar, and disappeared into the woods. We rode back to the trailer in silence, loaded everything, paid the elderly woman, and left. Weeks later, she called and asked if we had encountered a pine goblin back in the woods. After some clarification, I realized she meant the man we saw. She said she figured we had, because a few days after we left, a bunch of things that had gone missing from her house, barn and yard suddenly reappeared on her back porch. I know it's not the scariest story out there, but it's mine, and I'll never forget it. Story 29. I'm not sure if anyone else has mentioned this, but the Hinterkaifeck murders are easily the creepiest true crime story I've ever come across. I studied criminal justice and sociology in college, and during a project on violent crime, this story stuck with me ever since. In the early 1920s, on a rural farm in Germany, an elderly man, his wife, their adult daughter, her 2 children, and the family's maid were all killed with a mattock. The unsettling part is that evidence suggests the murderer may have been hiding on the property for days before the attack and remained there for several days after. Before the murders, the family found strange footprints in the snow around the property, a newspaper from a town no one had visited, and a broken lock on the tool shed. That same shed was where the mattock, the murder weapon, was kept. The maid had only recently started working for the family. The previous maid had quit, saying she heard strange noises and footsteps at night and believed the house was haunted. Each family member was lured to the barn and killed one by one. The youngest child may have survived briefly, as evidence suggested she crawled through the straw and even pulled out her own hair after the attack. No one noticed the crime for several days, until the children failed to show up at school. When people finally arrived at the farm, they found the bodies, Yet strangely, the livestock had been fed, the dog cared for, the fireplace kept burning, and even the mail brought inside. No one was ever charged. Theories range from a spurned lover to a coordinated conspiracy, or even the daughter's supposedly deceased husband returning after faking his death during World War I. Story 30. I can't go into too many details without revealing my identity, since I've shared this story with several friends. All I'll say is that when I was in elementary school, a group of us decided to try a Ouija board one day. At first, it felt like a joke, but that changed the moment someone asked if there was something in the room. That's when everything shifted. I saw something out of the corner of my eye. When I turned to look, there were two shadowy figures standing in the closet next to me, their glowing yellow eyes fixed on me. I screamed, then everyone screamed, and we ran out of the room in a complete panic. The worst part, we never closed the session. I wouldn't learn until high school how serious that could be. After that, the family who lived in the house started experiencing strange and extremely out-of-character behavior. Thankfully, it eventually passed, and they're okay now. But I'll never forget it. Whatever those things were, I want no part of them ever again. As a strange prelude to all this, my mother, her best friend, my godmother, her sisters, and some of their childhood friends once predicted the death of a well-known politician's family using a Ouija board. They were close to the family, and this happened when they were just kids. It wasn't just them. Others in their circle who used the board also experienced unsettling things. My mother always warned me not to play with one, sharing that story. Whenever I asked my godmother about it, she would get this uneasy look and repeat the same warning. Of course, I didn't listen. I learned the hard way. Fortunately, no one got seriously hurt, but I'll never mess with something like that again. Story 31. I'm not sure if this was one of the scariest experiences of my life, but when you're on a trip with your family, enjoying yourselves, danger seems distant, even when it's right in front of you. During a long road trip, our driver took us into a forest despite a sign clearly stating, "The road ends here." There was no GPS, and after about 15 minutes, we told him to turn around. But the path was too narrow, and there was no space to turn the SUV, so he kept driving in reverse until we finally reached the same sign again. The next day, while we were on our way back home, still about 1,500 kilometers away, the driver started dozing off. None of us knew how to drive, and in India, most people hire drivers rather than driving themselves. The first time he drifted off, the car nearly went over a cliff until someone shook him awake. He hit the brakes just in time. Later, his eyes were closed again as our car sped between several massive transport trucks. We didn't alert him that time, afraid he might slam the brakes and get us rear-ended. He eventually woke up on his own. Fortunately, the road was straight, with no curves that could have caused disaster. But it was a close call. After multiple near misses, we finally arrived home. Later that afternoon, we realized how serious things had been. We had somehow made it through with only a broken right indicator. There were 11 people in that SUV, including the driver, who had never driven more than 300 kilometers in one go before. We had asked him to cover 5 times that. We were incredibly lucky. At the time, we were unaware of how dangerous the situation was. But reflecting on it still sends chills down our spines. Story 32. This happened about 10 years ago when I was still living at my parents' house. One evening, my entire family, my brother, sister, and parents, were at a Major League Baseball game. It was a night game, so it ran a bit late. I was in high school working as a lifeguard, and I usually got off work around 9 p.m. The pool was close to home, so I could get there quickly. I came home, took a shower, and was hurrying to get ready for a party that one of my coworkers was throwing. As I was stepping out of the shower and into my room, I heard shuffling and footsteps going downstairs. Thinking my family had returned, I shouted, "Hello?" And then, "Mom? Dad?" But no one responded. I kept hearing footsteps, and then I heard the garage door opening. At the time, it could be opened manually because the opener was broken. That's when I got really freaked out. I realized I was the only one home. I ran across the street to get my neighbor and her son, armed with a samurai sword. I was that scared. We walked through the house. Eventually, she called the police. During a second walkthrough, we found that my dad's cash, about $200 to $300, was gone, along with my mom's diamond rings and earrings. We also found a pair of earrings lying on the floor and the jewelry box open. The police confirmed what we had feared. The house had been in the process of being robbed when I got home. I must have interrupted them. I had been inside the house with the intruders, unaware, until they heard me yelling and realized someone was home. That's when they ran, using the broken garage door to escape. The officer told us it was the third break-in in our area that week and that the police had been keeping an eye on the neighborhood without alarming the public. It still ranks as one of the scariest experiences I've ever had. That gut-wrenching moment when I realized my family wasn't home and that someone else had been there with me was absolutely terrifying. Story 33. When I was a little kid, I had a recurring nightmare almost weekly. In the dream, I'd be in the basement and hear a meow. I would search in the dark for the source of the sound and find a sunken window at eye level, with just a little filtered light coming through. Lying in the window would be a dead gray cat with empty eye sockets fixed on me, letting out a mournful shriek. Sometimes one of its eyes would glow red. And when that happened, everyone I loved would die. I would wake up at various points in the nightmare. It got so intense one summer that I started sleeping with the lights on all night. Every time I heard a cat, I was terrified it would be the eyeless gray one from my dream. Fast forward 25 years, and I'm buying my first home with my wife. It doesn't have central air, so for the summer we started sleeping in the basement. It had one of those exact same sunken windows. One night during our first week there, we woke up to the sound of a cat meowing and frantically trying to get into the basement through the window. In the dim light, I saw a gray cat, and I swear, I saw an empty eye socket staring right at me. Ever since then, we've slept upstairs. But here's twist. The cat turned out to be incredibly sweet. His name is Lou, and he even runs alongside me when I go jogging. He's also become great friends with our new Australian Shepherd puppy. Lou is the most social cat I've ever met. Story 34. When I was 16, my grandparents hired me to house sit for 3 weeks at their farmhouse in a small town. Everything had gone smoothly, especially considering I was completely alone in a big house for that long. On the second to last night of my stay, around 1 a.m., a thunderstorm rolled in. I turned everything off and decided to head to bed. I was upstairs in the front bedroom that overlooks the driveway, getting ready in the bathroom, when I heard a loud noise outside, something like a tractor or riding mower. Normally, that wouldn't be strange since my uncle, who lives nearby, handles the lawn care. But at 1 a.m. during a thunderstorm, that was weird. Then I heard the side door open and the sound of heavy work boots entering the house. I assumed it was my uncle, maybe coming to help in case of a power outage. What threw me off was the fact that the 3 German shepherds who were lying at the foot of the bed didn't react at all. These dogs go wild at the slightest sound. But now, nothing. I looked out the window. No vehicles, no tractor, nothing in the driveway. Then the stomping grew louder, and it started to sound like someone was hitting the ceiling below me with a broom. That's when the dogs started barking like crazy, and I went into full panic mode. The storm was intensifying, and so was the banging. Suddenly the power went out, and everything stopped. No more dogs barking, no more stomping, no more banging. The room was pitch black. I hid under the covers and tried to call my uncle in a complete panic. After 5 minutes, everything was completely silent, and the storm moved on. It was the scariest, most surreal night I've ever experienced. Story 35. My mother was always emotionally abusive. I suspect she may have had a personality disorder, possibly borderline or narcissistic. I'm not a therapist, so I can't say for certain. She refused to teach me how to drive because she never wanted me to leave her. At one point, she even used a kitchen appliance to burn the back of my hand because dinner wasn't ready when she came home from work. Despite her controlling nature, I eventually went to college. While I was away, I helped my father and stepmother begin a custody case for my younger brother and sister. I was 19 at the time. My brother was 13 and my sister 11. My father eventually obtained emergency custody. During Christmas break of my freshman year, I went home to help my mother clean her house. This was my way of giving her one last chance. If she could clean her home and get professional help, she might be able to get partial custody back. I still wanted her to improve, because even after everything, I still loved her. On Christmas Day, she was on the phone with her lawyer, someone she called constantly. He told her I would be testifying for my father. At that moment, I was getting ready to leave for the bus station. I was packed and on the phone with my dad, waiting for her to finish the call. What happened next felt like slow motion. She walked in from the kitchen holding a gun, an old one that had belonged to her father. It hadn't been used in years. The years. Her eyes were cold, like they always were when she got like this. She asked me how I had the nerve to stay in her house while helping my dad take her kids away. I don't remember the gunshot itself, but I remember the drywall exploding and the heat of something passing close to my head. She tried to fire again, but the gun jammed. The next thing I knew, I was running down the road, still on the phone with my dad. I don't remember grabbing my bags. I don't even remember the running itself until I was 3 blocks away and heard my dad shouting to make sure I was alive. I never called the police. I was still trapped in the mindset of a victim. I took a cab to the Greyhound station and arrived 2 hours early. My dad and stepmom kept calling to check on me. I was too afraid to even use the restroom, scared she might find me. When I finally got to my father's house, I found out I had a cut on my cheek. Maybe from plaster, maybe from debris. No one at the station even told me I was bleeding. Eventually, my brother and sister came into my father's full custody. I got a restraining order. But going completely no contact with my mother took much longer. I'm now married and have a 1-month-old daughter. Every few months, I have moments where I feel like I'm trapped in a dying dream. That maybe I'm still on that floor, surrounded by chaos, and imagining a better life. But every time, I'm thankful to wake up beside my husband and remember that I made it out. Story 36. Sometimes I wonder if I have a hyper-protective guardian angel or some kind of sixth sense. Because there have been moments in my life when an overwhelming sense of dread hit me. Right before something bad happened, I have 2 examples that still give me chills. The first happened when I was 8. My family was in Florida, staying at a really upscale hotel thanks to my dad's work conference. While my dad worked, the rest of us were there on vacation. We were headed to the beach, and like any kid, I claimed I didn't need to use the restroom. Until we got all the way to the hotel lobby. My mom, her arms full of beach gear, handed me the key card and said she'd come get me once everything was set up on the beach. When I reached our room, the key card didn't work. It had demagnetized earlier that day, so I figured I'd just wait. I even climbed into a hallway window nearby to sit and wait comfortably. That's when the dread hit me, so intense that it made me nauseous. I don't know why, but I had to leave. I got into the elevator and rode all the way down, thinking I'd get the card fixed and return quickly. But as soon as I hit the lobby, it felt like I snapped out of a fog. I realized I hadn't even gone to the front desk. I turned right back around and returned upstairs. My mom was at the door, frantically knocking, furious that I had disappeared. I told her the key hadn't worked, but when she tried it, it opened right away. She assumed I'd run around the hotel or gotten distracted. That night, she couldn't find her credit card. My dad had to use his instead, but it got declined even though they shared an account. Turns out, while I was upstairs trying to use the bathroom, we were being robbed. Someone had used her card to try and buy a $1,000 TV out of state. My sudden nausea and dread may have saved me from coming face to face with whoever broke in. The second time was years later. I was 16. My maternal grandfather had been in the Veterans Hospital for a foot infection. He was expected to make a full recovery and then do some rehab. But one night I woke up at 3 a.m. with that same sense of dread in my stomach. I got up, checked on my little sister, then walked to the other side of the house. I heard my mom quietly crying behind her bedroom door. I knocked and she came out in tears. My grandfather had passed away suddenly from a heart attack. Since then, I always listen to that feeling. I don't know what it is, but I know it's real, and I believe it's helped me more than once.